Emily Harper, 29 years old, youngest female billionaire in America, having dinner at Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant with her business partners. Then she saw him, David Mitchell, her household employee for 3 years, sitting at a corner table, on a blind date. The man across from him was on his phone, ignoring David, ordering expensive dishes without asking. Then the check came, $200. The man looked at it, laughed, grabbed his jacket, and walked out, leaving David alone, with barely $5 in his pocket. David opened his wallet, counted his money, his eyes filled with tears. Pure humiliation, the cruelest blind date trap ever. Emily watched from across the restaurant. David, the most honest, gentle worker she'd ever had, being destroyed by someone's cruelty. She didn't think. She stood up. Her partner stared. She crossed the restaurant, sat down at David's table, in the chair the other man had just abandoned. What she did next changed both their lives forever. She paid the bill, ordered champagne, and for the first time in 3 years, truly talked to the man who worked in her home. 2 years later, they got married. Emily Harper never imagined that one night at the Terrace restaurant would change her existence forever. The youngest female billionaire in America was having dinner with her business partners when she noticed a familiar man sitting at the corner table. It was David Mitchell, her household employee who had been working at her Rose Manor estate for 3 years. But what she saw left her frozen. The elegant man across from David stood up laughing after seeing the check, leaving him alone with barely $5 in his pocket to pay for a $200 dinner. It was a blind date arranged through a dating app, and David had just suffered the cruelest humiliation of his life. While the man walked away mocking him, David remained seated with watery eyes, staring at the check he couldn't afford. Emily, who knew him as the most honest and gentle worker she had ever had, felt something break inside her. What she did in the following minutes would forever change both their lives, proving that sometimes true love is born from the most unexpected gestures. Emily Harper had everything a 29-year-old woman could desire. Heiress to the Harper empire, which extended from fashion to luxury goods, she owned villas in the Hamptons, apartments in Manhattan and Los Angeles, dream cars, and jewels worth fortunes. But that November night, sitting at the table of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, she felt emptier than ever. She was having dinner with her partners to discuss the acquisition of a hotel chain, but her mind wandered elsewhere. Around her moved attentive waiters. The atmosphere was refined. The dishes were works of art. Yet everything seemed artificial to her, lacking human warmth. It was then that she saw him in the opposite corner of the restaurant, seated at a table for two, David Mitchell. Recognition was immediate. That 32-year-old man had worked as a household employee at her mansion for 3 years. Tall, with brown hair and kind eyes, David had always been the perfect employee. Punctual, discreet, efficient. He never spoke about himself, performed his work in silence, and left without bothering anyone. Emily observed him with curiosity. David wore a dark suit that, although not expensive, gave him elegance. His hair was carefully combed, and his face showed a nervous expression. Across from him sat a man about 40 years old with a disheveled appearance, gesticulating animatedly while talking on his phone. David continuously checked his watch, drank water in small sips, and smiled politely when the other man addressed him. Emily realized she was witnessing a date, probably arranged through one of those dating apps that were fashionable. The man across from David seemed completely disinterested. He spent more time on the phone than conversing. He ordered expensive dishes without consulting the menu and treated the waiters with arrogance. David, on the contrary, was kind to everyone, thanked every small service, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know his companion. Emily looked away for a few minutes, concentrating on the work conversation. When she looked back toward David's table, the scene she saw left her petrified. The waiter had just brought the check. The elegant man took it, looked at it, and burst into contemptuous laughter. He got up from the table, grabbed his jacket, and with a mocking grimace said something to David that made him turn pale. Then he left, abandoning David alone at the table with the check in his hand. Emily saw David open his wallet and count the money he had. A few bills that evidently weren't remotely enough to cover the expense. The expression on his face was one of pure desperation. He looked around searching for a solution, his eyes filling with contained tears. In that moment, Emily understood she was witnessing one of the cruelest humiliations a human being can suffer. David, the man who for 3 years had cared for her home with dedication and respect, had been deliberately put in an impossible situation by someone who evidently enjoyed playing with others' feelings. Without even realizing it, Emily stood up from her table. Her partners looked at her in surprise, but she didn't flinch. She crossed the restaurant with determined steps, her heart beating hard for what she was about to do. When she reached David's table, he looked up. Recognition was immediate, followed by a wave of shame that colored his cheeks. She was the last person in the world before whom he would have wanted to find himself in that situation. David immediately stood up, stammering confused apologies, but Emily stopped him with a hand gesture and naturally sat down in the place the other man had just left empty. What she said and did in the following minutes would forever change the perception they had of each other, opening a completely new chapter in their lives. David remained standing next to the table, mortified beyond all imagination. Of all the people who could have witnessed his humiliation, it had to be precisely his employer, the only person on whom he depended economically, the only one who could fire him with a simple word. Emily looked at him with an expression he had never seen before. There was no judgment in her eyes, no superiority. There was something that resembled understanding, perhaps even compassion. Without saying a word, Emily took the check from David's trembling hands and examined it. $200 for a dinner he hadn't even wanted to order. The other man had deliberately chosen the most expensive dishes, knowing perfectly well what he was doing. David began to stammer explanations. It was his first date in years. He had thought he had finally met someone special through the app. The man had written to him for weeks. He seemed interested, intelligent, mature. He had proposed meeting at that restaurant, saying he would pay. David had never imagined it was a cruel trap. Emily listened in silence, seeing a side of David she didn't know. For 3 years, she had dealt with a perfect but distant employee. Now she had before her a vulnerable, wounded man who was living through one of the most difficult moments of his life. When David finished explaining, Emily did something completely unexpected. She called the waiter and ordered a bottle of the house's best champagne. Then she addressed David with a decisive but gentle tone. She told him to sit down, not as an employee before his employer, but as person before person. She wanted to hear his story, understand who the man she had only seen as a silent presence in her house for 3 years really was. David sat down slowly, incredulous at what was happening. Emily paid the check without even looking at it, as if $200 were pocket change, but her gesture went far beyond money. She was saving David's dignity, allowing him to leave that situation with his head held high. While they waited for the champagne, Emily began to ask questions. She wanted to know about his life, his dreams, what he did in his free time. David answered with initial hesitation, then with growing openness. He discovered that behind that apparent security of a rich and powerful woman, Emily had genuine curiosity about people. David told her about his degree in philology, about the teaching job he had to leave due to his sick mother's financial problems, whom he cared for in his free time. He explained that working as a household employee wasn't his dream, but it was honest work that allowed him to support himself and help his family. Emily listened, fascinated. She had never imagined David was so cultured, so sensitive. He spoke of books with passion, of art with competence, of music with deep knowledge. He was a man who had had to hide his true nature to adapt to the role circumstances had imposed on him. The champagne arrived, and Emily proposed a toast, not to the disastrous night David had experienced, but to the possibility of truly getting to know each other for the first time. David took a sip and felt something strange occur inside him. For the first time in years, someone was seeing him for who he really was, not for the work he did. The conversation flowed naturally for over an hour. Emily discovered that David had a subtle sense of humor, vast culture, a sensitivity she had rarely found in men from her world. David, for his part, saw a completely different woman from the one he had imagined. Emily wasn't just rich and powerful. She was intelligent, curious, and surprisingly lonely. When they finally stood up to leave, both knew that something had changed irreversibly. They were no longer employer and employee. They were two people who had truly met for the first time, discovering they had much more in common than they ever could have imagined. Emily accompanied David to the subway stop. Before saying goodbye, she told him she wanted to continue that conversation. Not at the mansion, not in the work relationship, but as people. David accepted, still incredulous at what was happening in his life. That night, both remained awake for a long time, rethinking the evening. David couldn't believe that the richest woman he knew had sat with him, listened to him, treated him as an equal. Emily, for her part, realized she had spent one of the most interesting nights in recent years. Neither of them imagined that this was only the beginning of a story that would change both their lives in ways they never could have foreseen. The days following that evening were different for both. David continued working at Emily's mansion as always, but now there was an electric tension in the air. They exchanged fleeting glances, barely sketched smiles, words that hid much more. Emily began to observe David with new eyes. She noticed how he handled the books in her library with reverence, how he arranged flowers with artistic taste, the delicacy with which he cleaned art objects. He demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond that of a simple household employee. One night, she found him in the library absorbed in reading a volume of Robert Frost with underlined pages. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to speak with him outside the formal work relationship. David became animated, telling her about his passion for literature, revealing a deep understanding born from years of study. That conversation lasted for hours. Emily discovered that David had written literary articles, knew 5 languages, played the piano. It was a world she had never suspected existed in that silent man. The evenings together became customary. They talked about books, art, music, philosophy. Emily realized that many of her ideas were influenced by those conversations, though David didn't notice. When Emily proposed he accompany her to a concert at Carnegie Hall, David hesitated. He was aware of social differences, of the gossip that would unleash, but she insisted. She wanted to share that experience with someone who could truly understand it. The concert was a revelation. David demonstrated knowledge of classical music that impressed Emily. He commented on the performances with competence, recognized styles and techniques. For her, it was experiencing culture in a new way, no longer as a status symbol, but as a source of authentic pleasure. On the way back, David told her about his dream of returning to teaching, of opening a school for less fortunate youth. Emily listened, fascinated, seeing the passion in his eyes. When they arrived at the mansion, they sat in the garden under the stars. Emily confessed her loneliness, despite being surrounded by people. David told her that since they had started, truly talking, he realized how much he had lacked a real human connection. In that moment, they understood that something profound was happening between them. It was no longer just friendship, but something more intense that frightened and attracted them at the same time. That night, both knew they had crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. The following weeks were a whirlwind of contrasting emotions. David continued working at the mansion, but his relationship with Emily was completely transformed. There was an electric tension between them, made of glances seeking each other, conversations lasting hours, silences charged with meaning. Emily found herself attracted to a man not by status or wealth, but by intelligence, sensitivity, and authenticity. David represented everything missing in her world: genuineness, depth, true values. David struggled with feelings that grew each day. He was in love with Emily, but he knew how complicated their situation was. She belonged to a world of privileges that seemed unreachable for someone like him. The turning point came during a rainy December night. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. Emily had canceled all her commitments and asked David to stay after work. She wanted to cook with him, something she had never done. The idea of preparing food with her own hands seemed incredibly attractive. David guided her in preparing seafood paella, teaching her the secrets of traditional cooking. She had fun like a child, laughing at her mistakes. As they cooked, their hands touched, their bodies drew closer. There was an intimacy that went far beyond friendship. They dined in the kitchen, at the rustic table normally reserved for staff. For Emily, it was an absolute novelty, but with David, everything seemed natural. They talked about travels, dreams, fears, hopes for the future. It was during that dinner that David found the courage to express his feelings. He told her he had fallen in love with her, but understood if she couldn't reciprocate. Their lives were too different, their worlds too distant. Emily looked at him in silence. Then she confessed that she too had fallen in love with him, with his intelligence, with the way he made her feel like a woman instead of just rich. For the first time, she had met a man who loved her for who she really was. The first kiss came spontaneously, sweet and full of everything they had said to each other in the preceding weeks. Social differences, practical problems disappeared. There were only the two of them, two people who had found each other against all odds. The following days were the happiest both had ever lived. They looked for any excuse to be together, to share moments of intimacy. David formally continued working for Emily, but they were living a love story that filled them with joy. With David, Emily felt free to be spontaneous, to laugh, to talk about her true feelings. David flourished under her love. His self-esteem grew. His culture found an interlocutor at his level. His dreams seemed achievable, but they knew they couldn't live forever in that bubble of happiness. Sooner or later, they would have to face the outside world, which would hardly accept their relationship. One night, embracing on the library sofa, Emily made a revolutionary decision. She was tired of hiding. She wanted to present David to the world as the man she loved, whatever the consequences. David looked at her with love and concern. He knew how much Emily was risking, but he also knew she was right. If their love was true, it had to be strong enough to resist any storm. Emily's decision to make their relationship public unleashed an earthquake in her social world. News that America's richest heiress had fallen in love with her household employee circulated through New York in a few hours, becoming the main topic of high society salons. Reactions were immediate and cruel. Family friends called, scandalized. Business partners questioned her mental stability. Celebrity magazines began speculating about a possible nervous breakdown or David's plan to seize her fortune. David lived through this period with a mixture of pride and torment. He was happy that Emily had had the courage to declare herself publicly, but he suffered seeing her attacked and judged for a choice of love. Some of Emily's friends had confronted him directly, offering him money to disappear from her life, accusing him of being an unscrupulous gold digger. The social pressure was enormous. Emily received continuous pressure from her extended family, from the boards of directors of her companies, from her legal advisors. Everyone urged her to reconsider before it was too late, to protect the family patrimony from what they saw as a dangerous opportunist. But Emily resisted with determination. She had found true love for the first time in her life, and wasn't willing to give it up to satisfy social conventions. Moreover, the criticisms and attacks only reinforced her determination. She realized how superficial and empty the world she had grown up in was. To demonstrate the seriousness of her intentions, Emily did something revolutionary. She offered David the position of director of a new foundation she wanted to create for the education of less fortunate youth. It was a role that would value his culture and passion for teaching, allowing him to realize the dreams he had had to set aside. David accepted enthusiastically but set conditions. He wanted the foundation to be truly independent, for him to earn the position by merit and not through his personal relationship with Emily. He wanted to prove to the world, but above all to himself, that he was capable of being worthy of that responsibility. The following months were challenging but exciting. David threw himself body and soul into the foundation project, developing innovative educational programs, seeking the best teachers, creating a structure that could truly make a difference in young people's lives. His competence and passion quickly won the respect of all collaborators. Emily, for her part, discovered a new dimension of her wealth. Instead of spending money on useless luxuries, she was investing it in something that could concretely change people's lives. Seeing David realize his dreams, seeing the first young people benefit from the foundation's programs, gave her a satisfaction she had never experienced before. Slowly, public opinion also began to change. The foundation's results spoke for themselves, and David proved to be much more than a simple opportunist. His interviews in newspapers revealed a cultured, passionate person with a clear vision of how to improve society through education. The decisive moment came during the foundation's first graduation ceremony. 20 young people from difficult families had completed an intensive study program that had prepared them to access university. Their speeches of gratitude, the tears of joy from families, the emotion of teachers demonstrated to everyone that what David and Emily were doing together had value that went far beyond social conventions. That night, during the celebration party, Emily watched David as he spoke with the young people who had completed the program. She saw the happiness in his eyes, the satisfaction of someone who had finally found his place in the world. She realized that their love story had not only changed their lives, but was having a positive impact on all of society. When David reached her, he took her hand in front of all those present. They no longer hid. They were no longer afraid of others' judgment. Their love had passed the most difficult test, that of time and concrete reality. That night, while embracing in the mansion's garden, both knew they had won their battle, not only against social prejudices, but against their own fears and insecurities. They had proven that true love can truly overcome any barrier when supported by mutual respect, shared values, and the will to build something beautiful together. 2 years after that night at the restaurant that had changed everything, David and Emily got married in a ceremony that became a symbol of how love can tear down any social barrier. St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York was packed with people representing all the worlds the two of them had managed to unite, from New York high society to the foundation's young people, from university professors to humble families from working-class neighborhoods. David, most elegant in a tailored suit, waited for Emily at the altar with emotion he couldn't hide. When she entered the church, radiant in a simple but refined silk dress, everyone's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't just a wedding. It was the celebration of a story that had taught many that true love knows no class differences. The foundation they had created together had become a model for all of America. Hundreds of young people had completed the educational programs. Many had managed to access the best universities. Others had started small businesses or become teachers in turn. David was recognized as one of the brightest innovators in the field of social education. Emily had completely transformed her approach to business. Instead of focusing only on profit, she had oriented all her companies towards social and environmental sustainability. She had become an example of how wealth can be an instrument of positive transformation of society. But the true revolution had occurred in their private lives. David had discovered he was a natural leader, capable of inspiring and guiding other people toward noble objectives. His self-esteem had grown enormously, not because of the money he now earned, but because of the awareness of making a difference in so many young people's lives. Emily had finally found deep meaning in her existence. She was no longer the bored rich heiress who spent fortunes on whims, but an engaged woman, a woman in love, a person who used her privileges to help those who needed them. Their love had matured, becoming even deeper. They had overcome together the criticisms, judgments, practical difficulties of two worlds meeting. They had learned to be a team, to support each other, to share not only beautiful moments but also responsibilities and concerns. One night, 3 months after the wedding, they were sitting in the mansion's library, which was now truly their home. David was correcting projects from some of the foundation's young people. Emily was reading her company's balance sheets. They worked in silence, but it was a silence full of complicity and love. When they raised their eyes from their documents and smiled at each other, both thought back to that night at the restaurant that had started everything. David remembered the terrible humiliation of being abandoned with a check he couldn't pay. Emily thought back to the impulse that had led her to get up from her table to help a man she barely knew. That spontaneous gesture had triggered a chain reaction that had transformed not only their lives, but also those of hundreds of other people. They had proven that authentic love is a revolutionary force capable of tearing down prejudices, changing perspectives, creating opportunities where before there was only closed-mindedness. David stood up and went to Emily, who set down her documents and took his hands. In that simple and perfect moment, they felt once again the magic of what they had built together. They were no longer the household employee and the billionaire. They were David and Emily, two people who had chosen to love each other and use their love to make the world a better place. The following night, they received a call that filled them with joy. One of the first young people they had helped through the foundation had just won a scholarship to study medicine at Harvard. He had grown up in an immigrant family, had faced every possible difficulty, but David's educational program had transformed him into a brilliant student. That call confirmed what both felt in their hearts. Their love wasn't just a beautiful romantic story. It had become an instrument of social change. They had taken the best of both worlds, David's culture and sensitivity, Emily's resources and determination, and had put it at the service of those who needed it most. As they fell asleep embracing that night, like every other night for 2 years, David and Emily knew they had found not only the love of their lives, but also the deep meaning of their existence. They had proven that when two people truly love each other and unite their forces, they can move mountains and change the destiny of many other lives. Theirs had been much more than a love at first sight or a modern fable. It had been proof that true love has the power to transform everything it touches, creating beauty, opportunities, and hope where before there was only loneliness, prejudice, and resignation. Give a like if you believe true love can overcome any social difference. Comment which moment of the story impacted you most. Share to inspire those who still believe in authentic love. Subscribe for more stories of hearts that find each other against all odds. Sometimes a gesture of kindness in a difficult moment can change two lives forever. Sometimes the most beautiful love is born when you least expect it, and where you least look for it. And sometimes two apparently different people can discover they're perfect for each other, because true love doesn't look at the bank account, it looks at the heart's account.